You know, there's a saying that he who speaks last must speak the least, because more wiser than them have spoken before him. So, the UN resident coordinator, the regional rep for the Pacific OHCR, fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen. I was in this room here yesterday evening. The room was full of people. It was organized by the Fiji Chamber of Commerce to talk about various issues pertaining to businesses and how they're running and what are the challenges they're facing. And I wish we had the same type of people also included here in the room today to what Sayed-Khaiyum was actually saying regarding this. Because really, if we are to get some traction in this space, we really need to engage with the private sector and more businesses more directly. And I think I'd like to, again, just talk off the cuff regarding some of the key issues. Sometimes the discussions of human rights, in particular when you have, for example, businesses and human rights advocates, there's a very dichotomous approach and sometimes even an antagonistic approach that's taken. And a lot of it, I think, stems from the fact that there's a lack of understanding of the issues that each group may face, or the importance of the issues that they place as far as their paradigm is concerned. And that paradigm shift is critically important if you are to get some traction. We, of course, are discussing human rights and businesses in the context of a pandemic. Pandemic which essentially brought the world to a standstill. Fiji, for example, has lost its tourism sector. We do not have any tourists coming to Fiji. When you had 40% of its GDP completely reliant on the tourism sector, directly and indirectly, it has enormous impact, enormous socioeconomic impact. People have become unemployed, there are lesser hours that they are working, and obviously it has a spillover effect on those who are in the ancillary services. In the same way that lady who may be selling boiled, EV to people who used to work at Fiji Airways or the airport outside some hotel, the workers used to come out and buy boiled EV, or the lady selling mitai. Nobody's buying it from her. Those ladies have gone out of business. It's a very practical level it affects them. Of course, globally, if you look at it, a lot of businesses are struggling. Governments overseas, in particular, the developed world, the developed governments are pumping in literally trillions of dollars, what you call quantitative easing. People essentially are printing money. I was reading an article yesterday where UK has never had such an economic contraction since 1700s. They have not borrowed as much since World War II. So there are new norms being set. The whole issue about how governments, have a more flexible fiscal approach in respect of managing the economies, in respect of borrowing, and how we actually look at borrowing now by sovereign is critically important. And indeed, the new paradigms are being created altogether. Amidst all of this, of course, is that you have people who are dying. The Spanish flu, 50 million people died. The world is completely different about 100 years ago. Today, the world is a lot more interdependent. We have global, supply chains. All of these new, dynamics are now in 2020. They did not exist 100 years ago. The world is a lot more greatly dependent. Fiji did not get nearly 1 million tourists in 1900. In fact, we probably did not have a tourism industry. So you see, the world has changed dramatically. And it's within this context that we're also talking about human rights and businesses. If you talk about businesses, you cannot paint all businesses with one brush. As has been mentioned, that there are many small businesses. They're struggling businesses. The lady who's selling EV, that's her business too. She may actually be employing 2 people to boil the EV for her. She's also providing a little bit of business to the guy who may bring her on the carrier to wherever she's going, say in Nandi or Suva. So, in fact, some statistics actually demonstrate that there's about 130,000 Fijians engaged in what we call the informal sector. And then, of course, there are those who are in the formal sector, but not necessarily large businesses. Some figures say that nearly 50 to 60% of all business in Fiji are actually very small, what we call micro, small, medium enterprises. There's a guy who's down the road, he's got 3 people working for him, and they fix your tire when it's punctured. That's his business. There may be a lady who may be making fry fish and cassava and selling to carriers that stop by in Navua. These are all types of small businesses. And they're not necessarily, creating pollution directly. May not be like another business. I can give you an example. Last week, Department of Environment, or Ministry of Environment, I should say, essentially gave a stop work order to a factory that employs about 300 people. They've been polluting the one river in Lamy. Now, COVID-19, 125,000 people have lost jobs or may have reduced hours. And here's the Department of Environment telling a factory, if you don't comply with this particular environmental directive, we'll have to shut you down. The river is floating with a lot of grease and fat and all sort of untreated discharge. But then somebody can come running along, as they did, and say, look, 300 people won't have their jobs for the next few days. So it's not very easy. It's easy to criticize. It's easy to say, well, yes, X, Y, Z must happen, but you also need to be able to put it into context. Sometimes hard choices need to be made. And one would hope, in this particular instance, of course, he erred on the side of ensuring that there is environmental compliance, because there was lack of compliance for a long period of time. But, try explaining that to the 300 people who may not necessarily get paid in the next 2 weeks. So, you see, those are the kind of dynamics that's at play. In the same way, in the COVID-19 situation, we've, of course, had a lot of people who've been affected, and they can, of course, fall through the cracks. This is why government in the budget has appropriated $100 million, 95 of which will be, $95 million will be to provide direct unemployment assistance. And we are finding on a daily basis that a lot more people are becoming a lot more dependent on that, because they could access their general account in FNPF. But as those amounts actually start depleting, a lot more of them are getting the $220 a fortnight from government. Now that obviously needs to continue, and that's essential, because people can actually fall through the cracks. They can fall into a poverty trap. We also at the same time have issues, for example, some months back, as I mentioned to the group here yesterday, that when, with the program of Love Your Locals, people can go in now, stay at all these fantastic hotels which they never could stay at, because now the rates are a lot cheaper. A lot of the staff did not want to come to work, because they said, if we come and work for Saturday and Sunday, maybe we'll lose the 220 that we're getting through FNPF or through government. So we then made an announcement and said, okay, you must go and work, you will still get your 220 a fortnight, even if you go and work on a weekend, and even if they pay you, on top of the 220. Why did we do that? It was because we did not want these people to lose their trade, their profession, their skill sets. Because once the borders open, then of course, tourists will come, and we want these people to be still trained. They still need to be able to work and carry out their work effectively and efficiently. So those are the kind of dynamics that's at play at the moment. And of course, talking about COVID-19, one of the main issues now, I think it's a global issue, it will become a human rights issue, and it is access to vaccines. If, for example, your travel will now be determined by you actually getting a vaccine, and if you don't get access to that, it becomes a huge problem. The richer countries in the world have already prepaid many of the pharmaceutical companies and said, once the vaccine comes out, you give it to us first. And what about us little fellows and fallies in the Pacific, in the smaller countries? So we've, of course, have been on the international fora, whether we're talking to the World Bank, whether we're talking to IMF, whether we're talking to the UN, whether we're talking to our bilateral partners, whether it's UK, Australia, New Zealand. We've said that we need to ensure that vaccine is treated actually as a social good, not purely as a commodity, because it actually relates to, human survivability, accessibility to jobs, accessibility to economic participation in the global economy. So those are the kind of issues that we are actually balancing, and human rights is very much dependent on that. And we are glad that countries like, for example, Australia, have said that they will try and provide accessibility to Pacific Island countries and put us on top of the ladder, because we need to be on the top of the ladder. We should not be restricted by our size, nor should we actually be punished for your success. We are the only country in the world, I would venture to say at this point in time, where we have over 220 days without any active COVID cases in the community. We are very lucky, of course. It makes our case a lot easier to argue with the rest of the world when we want to open up our tourism sector, for example, vis-a-vis the Bula bubble, etc. I think the other point that I wanted to make was in respect of some of the issues that were raised about the issue about communal approach to rights. I think the UN minority, the Committee on Minority Rights has dealt with this quite, I think, effectively and significantly. It does not mean because we have communal ownership of rights that therefore that there should be no protection. We have the Human Rights Commission, and more importantly, you need a Bill of Rights. Many countries in the Pacific actually don't have a strong Bill of Rights. In the Fijian Constitution, you have a Bill of Rights that recognizes a vast array of rights, in particular based on the notion of non-discrimination, even based on your culture. And you have various protections built into the Constitution itself. I think, but that does not in any way negate an individual's right to be able to exercise these individual rights. There's no contradiction, if you like, from that perspective. I think the other issue that we have to talk about also is when you have social dislocation, in particular brought about by economic changes, people do tend to get very parochial. There's the lady from I don't know which city she was in the States, but she talked about, for example, the rise of racism globally, and the rise to move to the right globally we've seen. A lot of it is to do with the economic dislocation. And people provide very simple solutions to very complex complex issues. And so communalism tends to become, a simple solution, and the them and us begins to get developed. And I think that's something that we need to be quite, we need to be alerted to, and indeed be mindful that does not creep into our assessment of human rights and into our consideration of the applicability of the UN human rights as a right applicable to all individuals in our society. Climate change, of course, is very, very significant for all of us. We are the cold face of climate change. The Pacific Island countries, as highlighted by Alice, in respect of, for example, you have an inundation of seawater that not only takes up land, but also it can have an impact on your ability to measure your EEZs. We have a climate change bill currently in the public space in Fiji. And if you look at the climate change bill, and I hope all of you have looked at it, if you haven't, please do so. It's available online and you can make the submissions. It also puts a particular level of responsibility on companies and the ability to participate in the climate change space. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize that climate change actually is a very insidious way that it encroaches upon your rights on a daily basis. And a lot of people don't necessarily, I think, recognize the enormity of it. Pandemics actually gets very good media, because it's all over the place, and it's very much at the first news item on television. But climate change is not necessarily the first news item piece on television. It's not necessarily the first news item piece on CNN or BBC. It may come when there's a COP, and then they all sort of forget about it. Whereas we are the cold face of climate change. We have 43 villages that need to be relocated to higher ground. Otherwise they'll disappear. The land will disappear. There's enormous impact in terms of cultural considerations, your ability to access food, your ability to access various services. I think within all of this, one of the issues that I found, I think I was in some discussion in one of the forums I think it was in New York or Washington. We also tend to, in a way, romanticize the past. Somebody was saying to me, well, we're all very resilient, and back in 1800s or 1700s, we still had cyclones in the Pacific, and our people survived it. Well, actually, it was very different. There were far less cyclones in that point in time. The frequency and the intensity of it was much reduced. However, there are very basic things that you now consider human rights that weren't rights then. Access to electricity, access to reticulated water systems, access to bridges, to roads, access to schools. Those did not exist 300-400 years ago in the Pacific. Now if you don't get electricity after a cyclone, people get annoyed by that. If you don't get access to road, if you don't get access to reticulated water system, people get annoyed by this. My rights are being infringed. And indeed, they would be correct in saying that, because the Fijian constitution says every Fijian has a right to accessible and potable water, drinking water. So you see, we have to be able to contextualize rights. There's no point in sort of harking back to the past. There are, of course, very positive things in the past in respect of, for example, biodiversity, the traditional knowledge. A lot of it has been lost, a lot of it needs to be rescued, a lot of it needs to be documented. Now, so that is being done. But we have to ensure that we are able to deal with each of these matters on its own merit. It's not a holistic or whole sinker approach to everything in the past is fantastic and everything in the present is bad. So I think a lot more smarter way, if we take that approach, then your ability, getting back to the topic of the day, getting the businesses engaged, would be a lot more fruitful if you have a more nuanced approach to it. If we are able to distinguish between those businesses that are doing the right thing, or who are willing to actually participate in this space, and how we can bring them along. Recognizing that there are businesses that actually face their own problems and issues, and how we can actually help them mitigate them. And of course, to be able to demonstrate to them that if you are able to, participate in this space, there may be commercial benefits for you. In the same way we say to businesses that if you have, sustainability built into your businesses, you actually have longevity in respect of your profits. You're able to have a very deeply embedded approach to longevity regarding your businesses. I remember saying about 7-8 years ago at a tourism forum, when we had first introduced the Domestic Violence Act, and the first time that it was ever done in Fiji. And I said to businesses, you actually have to be able to participate in this space, but more, at the very least recognize that if bulk of your workers or your employees, for example, tourism sector, are women who wait at the tables, who come and clean the rooms, who are at the reception, and if they are being bashed up at home the night before, purely from a commercial perspective, what would be the productivity rate the next day at work? What would be the rate of absenteeism? Purely from that perspective. So you cannot say that businesses don't get into the private space. Businesses need to get into the private space, because if you don't have an appreciation of what is actually happening in the private space, that have enormous impact on your business, enormous impact on the productivity levels of your business. If you go to, for example, Levuka, PEFCO, I think about 80 to 90% of all the workers, your canned fish that you get, are women. There are 2 ships. There's over 1,000 people there. Probably about 850 of them are women. Now, if there is domestic violence, if PEFCO is not able to deal with that and participate in that space, then of course the productivity levels of those workers will be actually very much reduced. So I think, we have to bring along people in these spaces, including in the business community. I think the last point that I'd like to make is that we talked about corruption. And most definitely, we need to be able to address corruption. And a lot of the times there's a lot of focus on what we call corruption between the state and a private business. And of course, you have organizations like FICAC, that's why it was specifically created, to try and stop systemic corruption. But believe you me, there's a lot of corruption in the private sector itself. It does not involve the state. So if I'm for example, a procurement officer in a hotel, and my job is to procure goods from a hardware company, And I don't necessarily do the tendering correctly. They may not do tendering correctly, but people pay a lot more higher price because somebody is being paid under the table. So there is also corruption within the private sector itself that needs to be addressed, and I think you can bring those values to that too. The other important point I think about corruption, which I've seen I think needs to be addressed quite significantly, is to do with the judiciary. There is a very I think the judiciary, in particular, including in countries like Fiji and other Pacific Island countries, the jurisprudence regarding corruption in Fiji and other Pacific Island countries is not very highly developed. And I can give you a number of examples of recent cases where people, in some other jurisdiction like UK, like Australia, or like Hong Kong, they have actually been convicted because the jurisprudence in those countries have actually developed. But because some of the members of the judiciary in Fiji are actually applying jurisprudence probably from the 1950s and 60s and have not necessarily applying the same principles as are being applied in other jurisdictions, we are seeing that the development of the law is actually very slow. And therefore your ability to successfully prosecute and get the deterrence built into a modern day economy, we're actually lagging behind. And that's something I hope that the judiciary can actually come up to speed with regarding corruption. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to, of course, thank the UN for organizing this. The pandemic, of course, has brought about a number of highly significant challenges for everybody, including socioeconomic challenges. Of course, as we know that even the simple example that I've used in the tourism sector, majority of the workers in the tourism sector, the frontline workers are women. There's a disproportionate effect on women, as we find there's a disproportionate effect on women, for example, whenever we have a climate crisis also. And we need to be able to address those fundamental issues. But I please would urge that in the next couple of days, that when you are having these discussions, to be able to reach out to a number of organizations from the private sector, if we are to actually seriously going to address the issue of human rights in businesses. Naka, thank you very much.